Hello, everyone, and welcome to our fourth and final lecture in Chapter 13. In this one, we're going to look at the power of the Christian or Catholic Church during this period. Here, guys, in the picture, this is the Vatican, St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, and we're going to talk about their power here and what they did and how they tried to influence this area. All right, so to set the stage, during this period, because of the warring that's going on, because of the breakup of Europe, because of the invasions and so forth, even though the church is the source of power, you are going to have a conflict that develops between the two. Okay, and Pope Deucalius I actually has a really good quote here to keep in mind for this idea. There are two powers by which this world is chiefly ruled: the sacred authority of the priesthood, so the church, and the authority of kings. So you're going to see this vying for power from the religious authority versus the political military authority. So the Pope controls religious matters versus the emperors and kings controlling the political matters. And as we know and we've talked about previously, the church has tried to become more secular during this period under Pope Gregory I and involve itself in political matters. So that's one of the areas for where this conflict is going to come through. And you're going to see that at various times the church and certain rulers are going to vie for ultimate authority in who actually controls Europe or their land. All right, so here's the structure of the church. So power in the church is based on your status and where you are in the actual structure. Pretty simple, is the head of the church is the Pope. The Pope's at the top. They have authority over all bishops and priests. So everybody underneath them, the clergy itself, they have control over. Then you have your cardinals. Then you have your archbishops. And then you have your bishops, which basically are the supervisors over the lowest level. So you could almost think of it as like, if you were to think of it in terms of like this hierarchy as the United States, you would have basically like the Pope would be like the national government or like Washington, D.C. Then the cardinals would be like the state government, or like even to go further, like you could have like a regional government. Like let's say all the Great Lakes states were under control of one person. That'd be like the cardinal. Then your archbishop would be like the governors of each state or the state government. Then your bishops would be like the county government, and then your priests would be like the local, like the town. So like you might have like, local city official, mayor, governor, regional governor, president. It kind of, if that makes any sense, in terms of the structure itself. And the bishops, they played a huge role because they were supervising and working more at the lower levels, or at least in contact more than the upper levels were with local towns and priests. Bishops were really used to settle disputes over practices and teachings because they're going to be the ones that are closer to the local practices by the priests, which was everybody's main contact with the church. But they also would work with the people above them. So that's kind of how they were the ones that really worked with the disputes over practices and teachings, is because they're kind of like the middleman between what's actually being practiced and then what the main groups, the top groups, want to have done. All right, so we've talked about this a little bit here in each of the sections moving forward in this chapter so far, but the church was a unifying force during what we call the Middle Ages or medieval times, or in some ways the Dark Ages. And they unify the division of Europe that is brought by feudalism in the years after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. So even though Europe's broken apart and there's all these different things that are going on, attacks and raids and wars and all this stuff, the church helps unify people together, and it is a stable force during this time of upheaval. And one of the reasons why that is not just because of the power it's able to maintain, but just from the idea that people are living very harsh lives. It can be very dangerous. and so forth because of invasions and attacks and so forth. But they can't really do a lot. But under the church, one of their teachings is that it preaches salvation. And if you can achieve salvation and maybe live a horrible life on earth but be saved in the afterlife, there's at least something to look forward to. Now, locally, the church was a unifying force because it was also a social center. It was where everybody met. I mean, we've looked at what a feudal estate looks like. Where would everybody go, regardless of their class within the fiefdom? They would meet at the church, and it provided a social aspect as well as a religious aspect as well. Excuse me. Now, these are baptism, confirmation, Holy Eucharist, anointing of the sick, reconciliation, marriage, and holy orders. These are acts in terms of what you're supposed to do as a Christian, in terms of what the church was pushing. A similarity within this that we've already covered in this year, guys. You remember the 5 pillars of Islam? You're supposed to carry out those 5 duties to live the religion. Same thing here in Christianity. Pretty much the same idea. Okay, there's just more than 5, and they're a little bit different. Okay, now church law is very important. Church law equals canon law. So we typically think of the word canon today in terms of talking about stories. So like if you're talking about Star Wars or other like the Avengers or the X-Men or whatever, you have accepted storylines, and then you have storylines that go outside of that. Well, take that idea and put it here in terms of law at this time. If the church developed a law, it was viewed as the law, the final law, because remember, the Pope viewed that he had authority over everywhere from Italy to England and Spain to Germany. So the canon law is church law. The church carried out and established courts to hand out punishments. Typically, the 2 punishments that they used were excommunication and interdict. So basically, an excommunication was where the Pope would excommunicate. They actually, in some instances, excommunicated other religious officials. We've talked about it in terms of the Pope in Rome excommunicating the Patriarch in Constantinople earlier. But typically, the popes would do it to kings, denying the king's salvation. So saying, look, you're going to be kicked out of the church, you cannot go to heaven, as a means of controlling them. Now, if that didn't work, what the church would do is, if the king continued to disobey, is they would issue what's known as an interdict. And basically what that did is said, anybody that's in the king's lands, that's underneath the king's control, the peasants, the other nobility, lords and vassals and so forth, they would be denied the sacraments, which is what these are, and they would be denied any and all religious services so that they couldn't achieve salvation. And if you think about that, that's a very powerful tool, because now you're not just attacking one person or a few people that are in power. Now you're looking at his entire population that's under him and trying to control them and saying, look, you live a harsh life. The only way you can really get out of this and achieve something greater is in the afterlife by achieving salvation. Because of your king and his disobedience, you can't achieve that. So it was a way to kind of push them further, saying, look, you can't do this, and using their people against them. And it did happen a few times. And basically what this did is it gave the church ultimate authority in matters when they questioned what was going on. Now we're going to move on to a king in terms of talking about what certain political officials did with working with the church or against them, or in conflict with them over certain issues. This man here, Otto I, he allied himself with the church. Now this is important because he controlled a large empire in Germany, as you can see here, mostly present day Germany, and he used the church for a variety of things, to help him fund his army and fund campaigns, but also to keep fellow nobles in check, so he had greater power over his people, which is important because this gave him a power base politically and militarily, but it also gave him a power base with connections to religious officials in his areas, particularly bishops and abbots. So he had connections with the monasteries in which were the places of power throughout Europe at this time because of education and because of the money going into the church. He actually invades Italy for the church, and the reason he does this is, or the reason why Italy, the church wants him to do this, is because there's groups that are attacking it. Italy is not under control of one group, and the Pope doesn't necessarily like what's going on. So he gets Otto to come in, invade Italy, take control back, establish control for the church under a few states, and so forth. And he is crowned emperor by the Pope. Now, this is important because when he's crowned emperor, this is the extension of the Holy Roman Empire. And this is a transition of the Holy Roman Empire from what we saw in terms of when Charlemagne was crowned the Holy Roman Emperor in 800 to now. So we're seeing it shift a little bit eastwards. And the Holy Roman Empire from this time moving forward is going to be centered with its focus on Germany, parts of Austria, the Czech Republic, and northern Italy, and so forth. So here's the church versus the Holy Roman Empire. There's some problems. Problems are the popes and Italian nobles over time come to resent control or power from Germany, from German rulers. So you have the popes and Italian nobles here, which actually are effectively a part of the Holy Roman Emperor, or empire, but the emperor is focused or based in Germany. So they're resenting that outside control. Over time, it takes more time with the Pope because there's that religious connection. The Italian nobles, the resentment comes in much quicker. One of the biggest problems, though, is the church disliked the practice of what's called lay investiture, and it's where the king actually started to appoint religious officials. The Pope viewed that they should be able to do that because they're the religious control. If thinking back to our structure here, they're at the top. They view that they should be able to appoint the officials themselves. This is going to start a lot of conflict between the church in Rome and the empires of Europe, not just the Holy Roman Empire. So in 1075, Pope Gregory VII actually bans this process, saying that church officials can only be appointed by a religious figure, in essence, the Pope himself, or the cardinals. Now, Emperor Henry IV doesn't like this and actually orders Pope Gregory to step down. In response, Henry is excommunicated. And it takes him a couple years, but in 1077, Emperor Henry and Pope Gregory meet at Canossa. They make up, and Henry is reinstated to the Catholic faith. Now, to take this step further, there's more issues with it, and it leads to a conference known as the Concordat of Worms. And Worms is a town in Germany. Typically, I'm not saying that weird, typically German W's do make the sound of V, and that is how you should pronounce the town. So the popes and kings continue to fight over this idea of lay investiture and who should be able to appoint religious officials. They meet in 1122 in Worms, Germany, and they come up with this agreement, this compromise, that the church does get to appoint the officials, but the emperor has the ability to veto the appointment if he deems necessary. So they make a compromise out of this, and this is what is known as the Concordat of Worms. All right, on to a very, very important Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick I, or Frederick Barbarossa. He is actually the first emperor to actually call himself the Holy Roman Emperor. And his lands in Germany are really just a patchwork of feudal territories that he's able to bring together. We'll see a map and I'll at the very end of this lecture, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. And what he actually does, he undertakes several campaigns. His most notable one is he attacks the rich trading cities of northern Italy to gain power for himself and gain more control. Well, he does this against the Pope's wishes because those are fellow Catholics, fellow Christians, and they kind of come more under the influence of the Papal States or have more of a connection with them. And you actually have these Italian city-states form what is known as the Lombard League to combat Frederick. And it's the Italian city-states and the Pope against him. Now, in 1176 at the Battle of Legnano, Frederick is defeated by Italians. In particular, the Italians had a significant military advantage, and from a technology standpoint, they were armed very heavily with crossbows and were able to defeat Frederick's forces. Now, Frederick comes into line. He actually even is one of the big rulers that goes on the Third Crusade with Richard the Lionhearted and King Philip of France. Now, while on the way to the Holy Land, while trying to cross a river on horseback, and he's all armored up, Frederick the First is knocked off of his horse and he drowns. And when he dies, just like we've seen in a number of instances, when an empire or kingdom loses a strong leader, it immediately takes a step back. Well, in this case, since his lands are kind of a patchwork of all these little feudal territories that we'll see in a map here in a bit, the empire just shatters into pieces, and he's not able to control his successors are not able to control the area. And this is actually going to play itself out, this feudal system in Europe and this falling apart here in Germany this state under Frederick Barbarossa. It's going to play itself out in terms of why Germany is actually not going to form itself as a unified country until Bismarck in the late 1800s. So it's going to play itself out, this breakup, for a long period of time. So the German states separate themselves. You have German kings trying to rebuild the empire, but they can't. You have systems of election for certain kings in certain areas by princes. So you actually have weak authority kings because the princes actually want more control. You see more clashes with various German states and kings themselves with the Italian city-states here, as well as with the Pope in Rome. So there's no real strong control. Now, this is the effective area of the Holy Roman Empire, with Rome being here, and various states making up the actual empire itself. And all these problems lead to control of fewer and weaker lands to establish power for one person. All right, and this is our last slide here, and this is what I was talking about. So the map on the left is how the Holy Roman Empire, which the borders are in red, was divided under the time of Frederick Barbarossa. There's a few states that have control, but or that are made up of this area, but he controls essentially everything. And there's various kingdoms and lords and so forth that function underneath it. Okay? But look at what happens and this is actually typical of feudal Europe in the centuries before Frederick, and in the years after, until you start to see the birth of the modern nation state. Look at the number of states it breaks up into across all of Germany and southeastern France and northern Italy, and as you move into Poland and Austria and what is today Czech Republic, and the Netherlands and parts of Denmark and Belgium. So these breakups are huge and going to have this lasting impact, not only in terms of life at this time and in showing that kind of extending this division from feudalism, but it's going to have an impact, like I said, later in terms of how Europe itself is going to be divided, or these kingdoms are going to be divided later on, and why Germany is not going to be this unified state until the 1870s, or why Italy isn't going to be a unified state like we know them today until the 1850s, 1860s. So this will play itself out over history and last quite some time. All right, guys, that's all I got for you. Just a reminder, please make sure that you guys review all the videos for Chapter 13 when you're reviewing for the test. There's a lot of good stuff in here. Go through your notes. Your lecture notes are really all you need to study for the test. I know I provide you with study guides, but please make sure you guys go back through these and use these as a resource to prepare for the Chapter 13 test. All right, guys, that's all I got for you, and I'll see you with Chapter 14 here shortly. See ya.